Bava Batra Daf Yomi Aleph. News travels, מחאה שלו בפניו. People connect by sharing information. It's one of the ways that we connect as human beings. One of my son-in-laws is a big Talmud of the Matmonim and has been a driving force behind it. Jared is a wonderful connector with human beings, and I've asked him, how do you do it? What do you say when you go up to a stranger? How do you start? Because he can just walk up to a stranger and in 2 minutes the stranger has shared the most intimate details of his life with Jared. And he says, I just say, what's up? And then he tells me what's up. People want to share information about themselves, about their lives, about the world. And even in our digital time, what are selfies? We think it's self-promotion. It isn't really. It's a form of sharing news. People don't know how to have conversations anymore, so they send photographs. This is news. I'm in Paris, I'm in Rome, I'm in Las Vegas, and look what I'm doing. I'm eating a nice piece of cake. And it's having conversation with pictures instead of with words. People like to share information. And it used to be that information was shared personally through individual connection, and then it became more formalized through letters and through newspapers. Years ago, I had a client who was a senior executive of one of the large African banks, and he visited a rural branch of his bank, and he was shocked to see a very long line of people twisting around for a long way outside of the bank in the sun of Africa, and he was very upset. And he immediately made changes and put in more tellers. That was in the day when you used to have human beings in banks. And he put more tellers into the bank so as to get rid of these lines. He was very upset about them. And people left the bank in droves and went to the competition to stand in lines in the competition. And they had to do some research to find out what that was about. And the African people said that's their chance to get news. When they stand in line and they talk to each other with people from other villages, they hear what's going on in the town. And he said to them, but you've got other ways of getting news. There are newspapers and there are phones, and there are ways to get news. You can rather do your banking much more efficiently. And they said that's, you Westerners like to get news in dry, sterile formats. We like to talk to people, get a feel of the news, of how it's affecting them, how it's affecting their family, how they're reacting and responding to them. It's not just about information, it's about human connection. We think it's all about human information. We think people connect so that they can share information. But the truth is people share information so that they can connect, which is much more important. And we have this principle in halakha. We have it, it's called chavra itle. Your friend has got a friend, and his friend has got a friend, and so news gets around. And that's a principle that is important in Hilchos Chazaka that we're dealing with at the moment, questions of acquisition of property, as we'll see, and it's important in Hilchos Lashon Hara as well, and maybe we'll get into that tomorrow. The Rambam summarizes the beginning of Chezkas Habatim. The Rambam very beautifully summarizes these laws of Chazakah, and let's just learn the Rambam so that we know that. Any time, says the Rambam, that Reuven, an individual, can prove that he has been using a field, taking from its produce for 3 consecutive years, that becomes a chazakah. Even if we know for sure that this property used to belong to Shimon, we believe Reuven that he bought it from Shimon. Yes, it's true, this property used to belong to Shimon. But for 3 years I've been there because I bought it from him. And we don't say to Reuven, where's your document? Can you prove it? Lefi shekvar avad lo, we assume that he lost it. He doesn't have to hold on to his document forever. V'anachnu omrim l'shimonim lo macharta lo kefi devarecha madua henachta le'echol perotea. If you, Shimon, the original owner of the field, didn't actually sell the field to Reuven, why didn't you object when you saw him planting and reaping and using the field? That's not normal. What happens if he says, I've been far away, I've been overseas, how would I know that he's using my field? Over 3 years, even though you're overseas, news travels overseas too. Is it possible that over 3 years you didn't know that Reuven was in your field? And if you got that information, you should have done a מחאה wherever you are. לפי שמן הכללים אצלנו, מחאה שלא בפניו הביאה מחאה. Don't think that you had to come back to Ra'anana. You're in New York and you hear that Reuven's in your field. You don't even have to come back to Ra'anana. In the days before there were planes and it would take weeks to get back, you don't have to do that. You can just get two witnesses together and make a מחאה in New York. And that's a מחאה. Why? How does that help? How is Shimon going to respond to that? Because efshar shelo higia hashmua, it's not possible that Reuven in Ra'anana will not hear that you objected to his holding of the field in New York. Because your friend has a friend and your friend's friend has a friend and news travels. That's what happens. So it's a principle in halakha that we actually rely on. There's an assumption that information travels even across the ocean. So then our Mishnah comes and says, however, even within Israel, Shalosh aratzot lechazaka. There are three different provinces, different countries when it comes to chazaka. Yehuda, ve'ever hayarden, ve'agalil. There's Yehuda, which is the central part of the country, where Yerushalayim is, in that area. And then there is Ever Hayarden. There's the other side of the Jordan, the Golan Heights and Transjordan. V'hagalil, and there's the northern part where we know there's such hardship at the moment. Haya b'Yehuda v'echzik b'Galil, b'Galil v'echzik b'Yehuda, eina chazaka, ad shehei mo b'mdina achat. We're not even talking about New York and Ra'anana, we're talking about Haifa and Ra'anana. If somebody's in Tzfat and somebody else is in Ra'anana, a chazaki in Ra'anana, you can't assume that the person in Tzfat knows about it and has made a mecha'ah. Ask the Gemara, "My kasava Tanakama, what does the Mishnah hold? Do you hold that a mecha'ah shelo b'fanav? Do you hold that you don't have to object in his face, that you can object at a distance, even in New York? In that case, why it should make a difference if he's not in New York, he's down the road, he's in Tzfat. Why shouldn't that be a good mecha'ah? And if you want to say, no, he's got to have an objection in the face of the occupier of his property, afilu Yehuda v'Yehuda namilo, then even if he's in Ra'anana and Tel Aviv, it's not good enough, because it's got to be in front of you. So what's it got to do with the north and the south? And this is the halakha. We hold that you don't have to object in his face, you can object at a distance. But this was at a time of Chirum, when there was conditions of war between the two countries that the person is in and that the occupier and that the owner are in. And during time of war, news does not travel. So why does it talk about the central part of the country and the Galil? It comes to teach us that even if there isn't war, it's just the north part and the south part of Israel, also the news doesn't travel. Says the Rambam in the Perish HaMishnayos, the roads weren't good at the time of the Mishnah. This is a very situational comment of the Mishnah. It's not a rule. Yehuda and Shomron and the Galil doesn't talk to the south and the south doesn't. It's not that. It's just the roads weren't good. So if there's a physical impediment for people moving between the two territories, that also means that news and information won't flow as readily. Tosfos goes into a discussion about why is the conversation about whether a mecha'ah has to be in his presence or not. Surely the issue is, does the chazakah have to be in his presence? In order to claim possession, do you have to have possessed in a way that the owner can see that you're there? That surely should be the issue. No, explains Tosfos. The key is the mecha'ah, because people hear about your possessing their property. That information flows more easily. The more difficult one, because people check up. They've got a property. They check up from time to time. What's going on with my property? They ask the neighbors to look in. They get information. But a mecha'ah, if I just get two witnesses and I say I'm objecting to so-and-so who's occupying my property in Brazil, how's that news going to get to the person who occupies the property? And nevertheless, we hold that unless there are conditions of war or there's just no passage of people in between, we hold that news travels, people travel, and with people traveling, news travels. There's an interesting Rabbeinu Gershom that I want us to look at quite carefully, because you see how beautifully and carefully explains the Mishnah. Rabbeinu Gershom is the first Perush we have of the Gemara, that where somebody actually took the Gemara and explained it to us like a Cheder teacher once. I've said to you once before that Rashi is is like our Cheder teacher. He simply explains the Gemara in just this most beautiful way. And of course, it's full of chidushim, but the important thing is that he clarifies it. He speaks it out for us. And Rabbeinu Gershon preceded Rashi. Rabbeinu Gershon was in the 10th century already. It was the first perush that we have of the Gemara, just consistently going through the Gemara and explaining it. And Rabbeinu Gershon, in fact, when he was young, was a Cheder teacher. He used to teach little children. That was his first profession. So it's just interesting that he writes through the Gemara with all the chidushim and the innovative ways of looking at it, but he writes it in a way that is so simple. It's just lahavdil, the art scroll of 1,000 years ago. Rabbeinu Gershom says on the Mishnah, Piska, Shalosh aratzot lechazaka shetzirich shiyu hamachzik v'hamareh b'malchut echad shel halalu gimel. The machzik, the possessor and the owner should be in the same province. Aval haya horeh b'Yehuda v'hamachzik b'Galil. But if the owner who is challenging possession is living in Yehuda and the possessor is in the Galil, in the north, ena chazaka. Bishum de'ein shayarot mitzuyot, because there is no human traffic between these two territories. Delezlu v'leimru le'dahai achzik b'sadeu kedei sheyavo v'yimche. So he's learning differently from Tosfos. He's saying the concern is that there's so little information flow between the north and the south that the owner in the south won't even know that there's somebody occupying his territory, his property in the north. That's how little information there is. But then he says something strange, the Rabbeinu Gershon, because then he says, Ad she'imo bimdina, until he's in one state, boto malchut, kamo b'Yehuda v'Yehuda d'shayarot mitzuyot, you've got to be in both of them in Yehuda or both in the Galil, umatzi lemimchi ulemishlech le'al yadayu dahani shayarot. Then he can send his mecha'ah, he can send his challenge through these caravans that go backwards and forwards to the occupier. So what is Rabbeinu Gershom worried about? Is he worried about whether the owner learns that somebody is occupying his territory, and for that there has to be a flow of information? Or is he worried about, does the occupier hear that he made a mecha'ah, that he made an objection, that he challenged the occupation? What flow of information are we concerned about? Tosfos says very clearly we're concerned about the flow of information from the mocher, the owner who is challenging, to the person occupying. We're afraid the person occupying will never hear that there's been a challenge, and he might throw out his shtarot, thinking he's been there for 3 years, nobody's challenged him yet, not realizing the reason nobody challenged you is not that nobody challenged you. Somebody did challenge you, you just don't know about it. The information didn't get to you. That's how Tosfos learns. But Rabbeinu Gershon sits on both sides. On the one side, he says, what we're worried about is that the owner will not hear that his property has been occupied. And then a moment later he says, the occupier will not hear that the owner has challenged his occupation. So which one is it? The Yad Ramah, who's now 200 years later in Spain, but the Yad Ramah in Spain had a lot of communication with the Balei Tosfos in Western Europe. Particularly we've got the communication in matters where the Ramah was one of the people who opposed the Rambam. And there's a lot of communication between him and the Balei Tosfos. So he clearly knew the Rabbeinu Gershom. He had access to that. And he says there are two explanations. And he says they're both right in halakha. That's fine that there are two explanations. The way the Ramah puts it, it sounds like some people explain this way and some people explain that way. But Rabbeinu Gershom does both, and without any kind of apologetics or explanation. But if you look in the Mishnah, you'll see the brilliance of Rabbeinu Gershom, and you'll see what Rabbeinu Gershom is teaching us, because he says the first one on the first part of the Mishnah. So let's learn the Mishnah very carefully. Shalosh artzot lechazaka Yehuda ve'ever Yarden v'Galil. There are three different provinces. Haya b'Yehuda ve'erzik b'Galil, b'Galil ve'erzik b'Yehuda. If you occupied in one province and the owner was in another province, eina chazaka, that's not a chazaka. Let's pause there. That's not a chazaka, meaning it will only be a chazaka if both are in the same province. You don't have to go further. And what does the Mishnah then say? Ad she'imo b'mdina. Until they're in the same province. You don't have to add that. You've just said if you're in different provinces, then the challenge doesn't work. implying you need to be in the same province. So why do you have to say Ad she'imo bimdina? Says Rabbeinu Gershom, that's where the Gemara learns from that the Mishnah holds מחאה שלא בפניו havia מחאה, that giving a challenge not in the presence of the occupier is still valid. So now if you look at the Rabbeinu Gershom, you'll see it more clearly. So on the first part of the Mishnah, what is the Mishnah worried about? At the first part of the Mishnah, we're assuming that you can't challenge somebody not in his face. What kind of a challenge is that? You stand in New York, you take two people off the street in Times Square, and you say, I must tell you something, I have a property in Ra'anana, and some Dr. Howard has just moved in there, and I object. And the two guys in Times Square say fine, and they have another puff on their drugs, and they go on their way. And that's a מחאה? Clearly not. We wouldn't think that was a valid מחאה. So then what's the problem? Why can't you be in Yehuda? Why can't one be in the Yehuda and the Galil? That's because the problem must be because we don't know that Dr. Howard has occupied this field. That's the problem. But then why does he say, Ad she'imo bimdina? You've got to be in the same Medina. He doesn't say you've got to be in the same city. He doesn't say you've got to be in the same room. He says you've just got to be in the same Medina. So what's changed by the addition of that phrase? Because now we say, because now we're learning that you don't have to object in the person's face. You can object from a distance, provided there's human traffic, provided people are moving backwards and forwards so that the news can travel. That's the chidush in that second part when the Mishnah says, Ad she'imo bimdina. It's from that Rabbi Abba Bar Memel, in the name of Rav, deduces that our Mishnah holds that you don't have to object face to face, you can object from a distance. Even as the Rambam says in the Perish HaMishnayos, even if you're overseas, there's 3 years for the news to travel. News will travel in 3 years as well. What we see from here, apart from the beautiful, brilliant way in which Rabbeinu Gershom, just by a few words here and there, explains the Mishnah, how we understood the Mishnah to start with, how Rabbi Abba Bar Memel learns the Mishnah, the idea of this additional of these few words, and how then the Ramah says, and both these things are logical. We're worried about flow of communication both ways. If there's a lack of flow of communication in either way, you can claim that the מחאה, the challenge, was not valid. The owner can say, I didn't know you were in my property. I'm at a place where there's no communication. The occupier can say, I didn't know you challenged. I'm in a place where there's no communication. There needs to be a communication flow both ways, otherwise it's not valid. But it doesn't have to be in front of the person. What you see from here is never assume that anything is confidential. If somebody else knows, everybody knows. The only way that something is confidential is if nobody knows. And we'll see, we'll have a chance to take this further tomorrow, hopefully, when we get into the halachot of Lashon Hara. Even telling somebody, please keep this confidential, sometimes makes that even more guaranteed. That people don't have the capacity, we're going to learn tomorrow, if that's where our learning goes, that people don't have the capacity to keep a secret. Why? And here's the important piece of psychology. People don't have a capacity to keep a secret because that's the way they connect. I've got something to tell you that you don't know. And that's how we create connection. That's how we create currency of the value of connection. Really, what do you know? What information do you have? We trade on information. And the more confidential the information, the more valuable it is as a currency of connection. So we need to know that people see information as a currency of connection, and they will share information. And they'll share it unintentionally, they'll share it in a moment. It's just so natural for people to talk and to share information because that's how they connect. And as natural as it is for human beings to connect, so natural it is to share information. So if you want information to be confidential, keep it to yourself.